My name is Teresa Langley. I am 68 years old, a retired librarian, and a widow who has lived most of her life in the same small town outside Chicago. I used to believe that books were my only companions after Henry, my husband, passed away. But there was one more constant in my life, one piece of him that remained when everything else had faded. Our 1967 Mustang Fastback. We restored it together long before the illness took him. To me, that car was not metal or rubber. It was memory. It was love. It was proof that I had once been seen and cherished. 3 weeks ago, pneumonia carried me into the hospital, and for the first time in years, I felt fragile, uncertain if I would ever come back home. I left the Mustang in my son Michael's garage because I trusted him. I thought he would keep it safe. It was a mistake that would reveal more than I ever wanted to know about my own family. The afternoon I returned from the hospital, the air felt thin and cold, though the sun was out. I walked slowly up the driveway, still weak from the illness, my small suitcase dragging behind me. The house was silent, too silent. My first glance was toward the garage. The door was open wide, and the space where my Mustang should have been stood hollow and echoing. For a moment, I told myself perhaps Michael had moved it somewhere else. Perhaps he had cleaned it or taken it to be serviced. But the knot in my stomach said otherwise. Michael came out of the house then, his hands in his pockets, his smile too casual, too proud for a son greeting his mother after weeks of sickness. He did not ask how I was. He did not offer to carry my bag. He simply tilted his head toward the empty garage and said words that pierced deeper than any fever or cough could ever reach. "Thanks to your car, Mom. Emily's having the time of her life." I froze, hearing the echo of his voice against the concrete. My daughter-in-law, Emily. I could almost see her in the photographs she loved to post online. Designer sunglasses, champagne glass in hand, the turquoise waters of the Maldives behind her. And I understood, in a rush of disbelief and betrayal, what Michael had done. He had sold the Mustang, sold the only piece of Henry I had left, the only thing I had clung to when nights grew too long and lonely. He had taken my trust and turned it into currency for his wife's vacation. I should have wept. I should have shouted. But instead, I felt a strange calm slide over me, like the quiet before a storm. My lips curved, not into joy, but into something sharper, sadder. I chuckled, a single sound, light as if I had heard a foolish joke. Michael's face twisted immediately. His voice snapped like a whip. "What's so funny?" The air between us thickened. He expected me to scream, to collapse, to beg for an explanation. But I simply looked at him with eyes that had seen much more than he knew. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "That laugh," I said softly, "is not because I lost everything. It is because you don't even know what it is you sold." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. The house, the garage, the trees along the street seemed to hold their breath. Michael's smile, the one that carried smugness and careless pride, drained from his face. In that pause, I realized something. My son believed he had stripped me of the only treasure I still valued, but he was wrong. He had no idea of the truth. No idea of the quiet steps I had taken before walking into that hospital ward. And that was the moment I understood. The car was not the only thing being tested here. It was our bond as mother and son, our history, our respect, and whether he would ever see me as more than an old woman he could take from. The tension remained suspended, like a held note in the air. The garage stood empty. My heart ached, yet my gaze did not waver. because deep down I knew what Michael sold was not the Mustang. When I was a younger woman, before illness or widowhood shadowed my days, there was one project that defined Henry and me as a couple. It was the Mustang Fastback 1967, Rally Red, a car we found abandoned in a barn just outside Rockford. Most people would have walked past it. The paint was faded, the tires flat, and the engine refused to even cough. But Henry looked at me with that mischievous spark in his eyes and said, "We can bring her back." I remember the smell of the garage where we worked, the constant perfume of oil and gasoline, the sharp tang of rust we scrubbed from metal parts. Saturday mornings were sacred. While our neighbors went fishing or watched sports, we knelt side by side, grease on our clothes, sweat running down Henry's temples. His hands were large, calloused from years as a machinist, yet precise as he turned bolts and adjusted spark plugs. My job was smaller, yet just as necessary. Sanding panels, holding the flashlight, writing down the sequence of each piece we removed. He never treated me like I was helping. He always said we were partners. There is one afternoon I cannot forget. The sun filtered in through the half-open garage door, catching the dust in golden beams. I held the hood open as Henry leaned over the engine, his brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, he looked up, grinned at me, and smeared a streak of grease across my cheek with his thumb. I laughed, threw a rag at him, and for a moment, we were not husband and wife, weighed down by bills and responsibilities. We were two dreamers, building something with our hands, believing that as long as the car could live again, so could we. It took nearly 3 years before she roared to life. The first time the engine started, the sound shook the walls. Henry stood tall, his eyes wet, his arms pulling me close. "Listen to her," he whispered. "She's singing." I leaned against him, my head on his shoulder, feeling the vibration through the floor, the steady rhythm like a heartbeat we had rebuilt together. That car became more than transportation. It was a vessel of our time, our sweat, our laughter, and our stubborn refusal to give up. When Henry's heart finally failed him, it was the Mustang that carried me to the cemetery. I drove behind the hearse, my fingers trembling on the wheel, my tears falling onto the steering column we had polished together. Every mile of that drive was a conversation with him. I could almost hear his voice reminding me to shift carefully, to ease the clutch. That was 10 years ago, and every drive since then has been a way of keeping him with me. The car key itself became my talisman, a small piece of metal, nothing to the world, but to me, it is everything. I keep it in the inside pocket of my coat, always. Sometimes, on winter nights when the house felt unbearably quiet, I would take the key out, hold it in my palm, and close my eyes. The ridges pressed against my skin, as familiar as Henry's touch. It reminded me that something of us still remained, something unbroken. Michael never understood this. To him, the car was old, a relic, a burden that took up space. To Emily, it was worse, an eyesore, something to be cashed in for vacations and glittering jewels. But to me, every nut and bolt was a memory. Every turn of the wheel a heartbeat from the past. That Mustang was not a car. It was Henry. It was our life. It was my proof that once, love had lived here, strong and unyielding. And as I stood in that empty driveway, looking at the hollow garage, I whispered to myself the truth I had always known. It was not just a car. It was the memory of my entire life. I live alone in the brick bungalow Henry and I bought when Michael was 3. I am 68 now, a widow who learned to patch shingles with a neighbor's ladder and keep a household running on lists. For years, I worked wherever work would have me. Mornings at the public library, nights wiping desks at the community college. When tuition bills arrived, I took extra shifts and told myself that fatigue was a small price for a child's future. Sacrifice felt ordinary, the way weather does when you stop naming it. After Henry died, the rooms grew larger and the hours heavier. I answered the silence with order. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteer at the library's literacy program. I brew weak coffee and clap softly when a sentence lands. On Saturdays, I help at the church pantry, packing bags and saying people's names, because names are a kind of dignity. In the evenings, I brew chamomile and read under a small lamp. The Mustang key rests in my coat pocket like a heartbeat I can hold. Michael grew up handsome and praised. On his father's side, there was always someone to catch him when he stumbled. His grandfather covered the deductible when Michael wrecked a second-hand Honda at 19. The lesson that took root was not caution, but rescue. I was the curfew and the calculator. They were the applause. No one intended harm, yet harm arrived the way rust does, quiet and persistent, thinning metal where you cannot see. By the time he married Emily, the pattern had hardened. Emily's family believes good taste proves good judgment. They are sure about restaurants, renovations, and the proper price of shoes. In their world, value is what you can post. The first time Emily saw the Mustang, she called it charming, then asked if I had considered selling while the market was hot. I smiled and said the market does not set the price of memory. Holidays became a choreography I did not lead. Plans formed on group texts I was added to after decisions were made. When I suggested a picnic at the lake, Emily said, "Sun is for teenagers," and booked a tasting menu downtown. Michael followed her cadence like a metronome. He squeezed my shoulder, promised we would do something simple soon, and then the promise evaporated. My preferences were optional. I tell this without bitterness. I packed lunches, found scholarships, and worked double shifts so Michael could attend debate camp and college orientations. When a lab fee threatened a semester, I sold my wedding pearls to clear the balance. When a molar throbbed, I pressed a cold cloth to my jaw and told the pain to wait until spring. I believed sacrifice was glue. I did not understand that invisibility can harden around the person who offers it. Emily is not a villain carved from stone. She is bright and charming. She works in marketing and talks about brand voice with an easy smile. When she is restless, she buys candles, flights, or shoes. She says experiences heal. She rarely means the kind you cannot photograph. She is practiced at arranging life so the hard parts happen off camera. Michael admired the ease and mistook it for wisdom. I know how I look to them. I wear thrift store sweaters and careful shoes. I count change. I fold plastic bags to use again. I am a retired librarian who reads the warranty before calling a repairman. It is easy to place a woman like me at the edge of the frame and expect her to stay put. It is easy to hear her silence and confuse it with consent. So, when the garage stood empty and Michael said, "Thanks to your car," I heard more than a sentence. I heard an inheritance of indulgence, echoed by the comfort of two families that had always stepped in. For years, I cushioned my son from consequence. That afternoon, weak from illness yet clear-eyed, I let the cushion fall. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I understood that my season of smoothing was over, and that understanding felt like a door finally unlocked. When I look back at my younger years, what I remember most is not leisure or ease, but carrying weight that felt impossible at the time. Michael was still in high school when Henry's heart began to falter. The man who once bent over engines with me, who laughed with grease on his face, now struggled to climb stairs without pausing for breath. I tried to shield Michael from the fear of it, telling him to focus on school, to keep his grades steady. At night, after Michael went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a deck of cards I never wanted to play. When Henry died, the silence after the funeral was the heaviest sound I have ever known. The Mustang sat in the garage, dust on the hood, as if waiting for him to return. People offered casseroles and sympathy, then returned to their lives. I returned to mine, except mine was stripped of the one partner who had shared the load. From then on, I was both anchor and sail. Michael dreamed of college. He wanted to study political science, maybe law. I encouraged him even when my chest clenched at the thought of tuition. I told him the same words again and again, words that became both lullaby and shield. I'll handle it. You just study. Or more simply, Milo George, kon ku hak ji. He never questioned whether I could. He believed me the way children believe the sun will rise. To make that promise true, I stitched together a life of double shifts. During the day, I kept my librarian job, cataloging returns, helping children find storybooks, keeping order in quiet rooms. At night, I changed into jeans and rubber gloves and cleaned offices after the last lights dimmed. Some evenings, I scrubbed chalkboards at the college where Michael would one day enroll, thinking of him walking those same halls as a student. My back ached, my knees swelled, but my determination outpaced the pain. There were times exhaustion blurred my vision. I would nod off on the bus, wake with a start, and run through lists in my mind. Groceries, gas money, overdue bills, and always tuition circled in red. Yet when Michael asked if he could join a debate team trip, I told him yes. When he wanted a new laptop for essays, I found a refurbished one on layaway. I swallowed pride and asked the bank for extensions. The refrain never changed. Mi lo juak, kon ku hag ji. It was not heroism. It was habit born of love. Still, the cost was real. I sold my wedding pearls to pay a lab fee. I let cavities fester until I lost a molar. I learned how to patch leaks with duct tape and patience. No one applauded, and I did not expect them to. The reward was watching Michael stride across his high school stage, diploma in hand, his eyes searching the crowd until they found mine. I believed that if I carried him far enough, he would one day walk on his own and look back with gratitude. I believed sacrifice was an investment that would return in kindness. What I did not see was how easily sacrifice can be taken for granted when it looks effortless. To Michael, opportunities arrived on schedule. The hidden labor was invisible. The Mustang remained, a silent witness to those years. On the nights when despair gnawed, I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel Henry had polished. The smell of worn leather steadied me. I would whisper promises into the dark, not to Henry this time, but to myself. You can do this. You must. Now, decades later, I see the pattern clearly. By always saying, Melo juok, kon ku hok ji, I taught my son that my labor was endless, that my limits did not exist. I built a foundation strong enough for him to stand on, but in building it, I erased the edges of my own humanity. That truth stings more sharply when I remember the garage door yawning open, the empty space, and Michael's careless grin. He believed he had the right to sell what was never his, because he had grown up certain that whatever he wanted, I would make it happen. And that is the shadow of love that forgets to draw a boundary. Michael and I speak often, though our conversations have narrowed into a script he finds reassuring, and I find exhausting. He begins with a check on my blood pressure, then drifts toward advice I did not request. If I mention the boiler, he insists on a contractor. If I mention groceries, he suggests a delivery service with a subscription I cannot afford. He means well, yet the refrain lands with the weight of a stamp. Mom, you don't need to worry. I'll decide for you. After Henry died, I made 1,000 small decisions alone. Now my son tries to take the pencil from my hand. He believes delegation is care, that authority offered without asking is love. I know the flavor of that kind of love. It tastes like lukewarm tea, sweetened for a child who has outgrown it. I listen, I nod, and when the call ends, I set down the phone and make my own lists, not from defiance, but from the steady habit of a woman who has kept a roof patched and a life upright. Emily prefers to text. Her messages arrive like announcements, crisp and perfectly punctuated. She sends links to upgrades I never requested. Ergonomic recliners, quartz countertops, a staging service that promises to modernize any space. When I thank her and decline, she adds a smiley face that reads like a sigh. The last time she visited, she stood in my hallway, took in the framed photographs, and told me a professional editor could build a cleaner story for the walls. Their certainty about my house extends to the garage. The morning before I was admitted to the hospital, Emily followed me to the back door and peered at the Mustang through the window. She pinched the cuff of her sweater as if air itself might stain it and said, bright as a bell, "Who keeps a pile of rusty metal in the house?" I tightened my grip on the door frame and felt the key press against my ribs through the coat pocket. Michael did not hear the edge under her tone, or perhaps he did and chose convenience. Later that evening, he waved his hand over the stack of envelopes on my table and announced he would set all my bills to auto-pay. Mom, you don't need to worry. I'll decide for you. I told him I enjoy writing checks because it slows time and lets me see what things truly cost. He laughed and kissed my forehead as if I had said something adorable. His gesture was tender. His assumption was not. I sometimes imagine how I must look through their eyes, an elderly woman with a careful walk and a thinning roll of stamps, a person who collects old objects the way others collect hobbies. They do not see the architecture of my days, the meal plan that stretches beans into a week, the habit of keeping cash for the neighbor boy who shovels the walk before school, the quiet ledger that balances dignity against need. None of this made me angry. It made me alert. So when illness pressed me into a bed that was not mine and the garage door closed behind me, I ran my finger over the Mustang key and whispered a plan. I would accept help that honors me and refuse help that erases me. I would let silence do the arguing I no longer wished to do. And when the moment arrived, I would be ready to measure what my son considered his to decide against what was, and would remain mine. I never thought the human body could betray its owner so suddenly. One evening, as autumn rain tapped against my window, a fever crept in quietly, like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. By midnight, my chest was heavy, every breath scraping as though shards of glass lined my lungs. By morning, the doctor's voice carried the verdict. Pneumonia. He didn't soften the word. He looked at me the way doctors do when they try to balance honesty with reassurance. But I knew enough. At my age, pneumonia is no small battle. They admitted me to the hospital right away. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the hollow echo of carts rolling down linoleum halls, and the steady beeping of monitors reminded me that my independence was slipping. Lying in that narrow bed, I realized how fragile everything had become. For decades, I had been the caretaker, the steady one. Now I was hooked to IV drips, with nurses checking my oxygen levels as though I might vanish if they looked away for too long. What worried me most wasn't the illness itself. It was the thought of leaving behind loose ends. I had responsibilities, things only I could manage. My car, for instance. That little sedan was more than just a machine on wheels. It was my independence, my last string of freedom after my husband passed, and after my children started building walls I wasn't invited to climb over. I couldn't leave it unattended in the hospital lot for days. I needed to know it was safe. Somewhere it would be seen, guarded, even if unintentionally. That's when Michael came to mind. My son. Despite everything, despite the bitter distance he and his wife had wedged between us, I still trusted the perimeter of his house more than a cold, impersonal parking structure. He lived in a neighborhood where neighbors noticed unfamiliar cars. My car would be safer there. I convinced myself this was only practical, nothing sentimental. Sometimes a mother has to frame her decisions in logic just to survive the sting of her own emotions. So, before they settled me in with another round of antibiotics, I made the arrangements. I asked a neighbor to drive my car over to Michael's house. I slipped the key into an envelope with a brief note. Just until I'm back on my feet. My handwriting looked shaky, as though even the pen sensed my vulnerability. I sealed it before I could hesitate. I told myself this was temporary, only for peace of mind. But deep down, I also knew leaving my car there would test something. Perhaps his conscience, perhaps his decency. And yet, there was something more. Something I didn't say out loud. That car key I sent over, it wasn't the only one. People assumed I had just one set, but mothers who've lived long enough learn to think ahead, to create backups, not only of possessions, but of trust. Quietly, without a word to anyone, I had already entrusted the real key, yes, the true one, to someone else. Not Michael, not his wife, not anyone they would expect. I told myself it was precaution, a simple safeguard. But in truth, it was my unspoken truth, the part of me that refused to be erased or manipulated, no matter how frail my body felt lying in that hospital bed. As the nurses dimmed the lights and the IV pump clicked rhythmically beside me, I held on to that thought like a talisman. Illness could strip me of strength. Age could steal my breath. But it couldn't take away my foresight. They might think they held the upper hand, especially with my belongings under their roof. But I knew something they didn't. I had already placed my trust where it would not be squandered. That silent decision, tucked away like a seed waiting for spring, was my quiet act of rebellion. And it would matter more than they could ever imagine. When I finally came back home from the hospital, the air outside felt heavier than it had before I left. Maybe it was just me, weak from pneumonia, tired from lying in a white room full of beeping machines. But something in the air felt different, sharp, almost metallic. I took a slow breath, my ribs still aching from the coughing fits that had landed me in that sterile ward. All I wanted was to walk into my house, make a pot of tea, and sit in my chair by the window where I could see the oak tree swaying. But the first thing I noticed when I stepped into the driveway was the empty space. My car wasn't there. I froze. My hands shook as I adjusted the strap of my hospital bag. For a few seconds, I convinced myself maybe Michael had moved it around back. Maybe he had taken it in for servicing. Maybe. But deep down, I already knew. Inside the house, Michael was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea. He didn't even look startled when he saw me walk in. Instead, he gave me a flat smile, like I had only been gone for a few hours instead of days. Emily was there too, her phone in hand, her nails clicking against the screen as if the world existed only inside that little glowing rectangle. "Michael," I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "Where's my car?" He leaned back in his chair, took a sip, and said casually, "Mom, family helps family. It's just a car. Just a car." I let the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. My heart thudded in my chest, but I forced myself to remain still, to breathe slowly. Emily finally looked up, her eyes bright and smug, and before I could even respond, she turned her phone around to show me a picture. It was the two of them, standing in front of some beach resort, palm trees swaying in the background, cocktails in their hands, smiling wide as though the world belonged to them. "See, we needed a little break," she said, sweetly, almost tauntingly. "That car helped make it possible. You should be glad you contributed to family memories." I stared at the photo. My car, my only means of independence. Sold, traded, or whatever they had done, gone, for their fun. "Family helps family," Michael repeated, this time slower, as though teaching a child. "We're all one unit, Mom. You don't need a car anyway. You barely go anywhere." I could feel the anger rising, boiling under my skin, clawing at my throat for release. The Teresa of a few years ago might have shouted, slammed her hands on the table, demanded answers, cursed them both until her lungs gave out. But standing there, weak from pneumonia, fragile but strangely clear, I realized I had no desire to waste breath. So, I sat down across from them. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at my son's face. The boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose homework I had checked late at night after long shifts at work. Now, that same boy sat in front of me, justifying betrayal with a phrase that sounded rehearsed, borrowed, hollow. "It's just a car," he said again, softer this time, almost like he was trying to convince himself. I didn't argue. I didn't even frown. I let my face rest in perfect calm. Because in that silence, I had something he didn't know. Something neither of them had bothered to consider. That sometimes power doesn't come from speaking, but from withholding. Emily, annoyed by my lack of reaction, nudged Michael. "She doesn't get it," she whispered loudly, as though I were deaf. "She doesn't understand we're trying to help her simplify her life. Less stress for her, more family unity. It's good for everyone." I watched them, their words spinning in the air like empty balloons. And in my silence, a strange reversal began to take shape. They thought they had stripped me of control, taken away my independence, reduced me to someone powerless. But sitting there, not responding, letting them fill the room with their excuses, I saw their discomfort grow. My calmness unnerved them. My stillness became a mirror reflecting their selfishness. I thought of the hospital, of how fragile life felt when I couldn't even catch my breath. And now, sitting in my own kitchen, I realized fragility could be mistaken for weakness, but in truth, it was only clarity. So I said nothing. And in that silence, I knew. This was no longer about the car. It was about the balance of power shifting, inch by inch, into my hands. That night, the house felt unbearably quiet. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than usual, echoing through the empty living room. Teresa sat in her chair, her phone in hand, the screen casting a faint glow on her tired face. She wasn't looking for trouble, but curiosity had a cruel way of leading her to the truth. She opened Instagram. The first photo that appeared made her chest tighten. Emily was on a yacht, the golden sunset behind her, a glass of champagne raised high. The caption read, "Living my best life. Gratitude always wins." Teresa's hand trembled slightly as she zoomed in. Emily's laughter, frozen in pixels, cut deeper than words ever could. Just 2 weeks earlier, Teresa had sold her late husband's watch, the one he had worn every Sunday for years, to cover the final down payment for the car. And here was her daughter-in-law, celebrating on a yacht that Teresa knew she had, in part, funded. Her thoughts turned sharp. They see their happiness as a right, and my memories as currency. Michael doesn't even see the difference. To him, it's just a car. To Emily, it's just another step toward the life she believes she deserves. But to me, it was a piece of my past. Traded away. The photos kept coming. Emily with friends, Emily with designer bags, Emily on the deck of the yacht again, leaning into Michael's arm as though the world were theirs alone. Each picture was a reminder of Teresa's silence in that living room earlier, when Michael had said, "Mom, family helps family. It's just a car." Teresa had not argued. She had not cried. She had simply listened. But silence, she realized now, had its own weight. Her mind wandered back to the years when Michael was young. She remembered patching up his torn sneakers so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school. She remembered working late shifts, her hands raw from cleaning, so that he could have piano lessons Emily now mocked as bourgeois. Every sacrifice had been invisible, until Emily's Instagram made it glaringly visible again. She pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. The ache was not just anger, it was grief. Grief for a son who no longer recognized the value of what had built his life. Grief for a daughter-in-law who saw family not as love, but as leverage. For a moment, she considered calling Michael, confronting him, demanding an explanation. But then she remembered his face at the table, the casual shrug, the dismissive tone. "It's just a car." Teresa whispered to herself, almost as if practicing for a future reckoning. "No, Michael. It was never just a car. It was your father's sweat, my sleepless nights. The stories etched into every corner of this home. And you gave it away like it was nothing." Instead of calling, she set the phone down. She would not waste her words tonight. There was strength in restraint. Watching Emily's curated world unfold on the screen, Teresa realized something important. Power wasn't always in speaking. Sometimes it was in waiting, letting the truth rot the mask others wore so confidently. Her heart was heavy, but there was a strange clarity in that heaviness. She would not fight them with raised voices. She would not beg for acknowledgement. If they saw her life as a source of funding, she would become something they could no longer calculate, no longer predict. The glow of the phone dimmed as the screen went black. Teresa sat in the silence, her fingers clasped tightly together, her breath steady. On Instagram, Emily was living her best life. But in the quiet of her own home, Teresa began to imagine a different life. One where she no longer gave away pieces of herself to buy a place in her son's world. That thought was small, fragile, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. The phone rang late in the afternoon. The shrill sound cut through the heavy silence of the house. Michael rushed to pick it up, his voice sharp, anxious. "Hello? Yes, this is Michael." Teresa sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm teacup. She did not move, did not speak, just listened. On the other end, a man's voice crackled with irritation. "Look, the papers don't line up. The VIN number doesn't match. I'm starting to think you two are playing me. Did you really own that car?" Teresa could see the color drain from her son's face as he stumbled over his words. What? No, that must be a mistake. It's my mom's car. We have everything." The man interrupted, furious now. "Don't give me excuses. I put down money. If this is a scam, I'll have you reported." "Don't think I won't." Michael's hand trembled as he clutched the phone. His wife, Emily, appeared from the living room, mascara smeared across her cheeks from crying. "What's happening?" she demanded, clutching his arm. He mouthed, panic rising, "The buyer. He says the papers don't match." Emily's face twisted into rage. "Fix it. Tell him it's fine. Just fix it, Michael." Her voice rose into a shriek that rattled against the walls. The buyer's voice came again, sharp and unforgiving. "I want my money back, immediately, or I'll make sure the police hear about this." Michael's words collapsed into stammers. "Please wait, let me check." Teresa lifted her teacup slowly, her movements unhurried, deliberate. The steam rose gently between her fingers. She took a sip, her eyes fixed on her son, watching him unravel like a boy again, caught in a lie too big to control. Emily's sobs turned into wails. "Michael, do something. He's going to sue us. We can't afford this." The room filled with the chaos of their desperation. His stammering, her crying, the angry voice spilling through the receiver. But Teresa, she remained silent. The only sound she made was the quiet clink of porcelain as she set her teacup back on the saucer. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "Michael," she said. Both heads snapped toward her. He was pale, sweating. Emily's eyes were red and wild. Teresa's gaze did not waver. She looked at her son as if weighing him, as if peeling back the years of excuses and bravado until only the frightened boy remained. "Tell me," she asked softly, "what car did you sell?" Michael froze, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Emily's hands tightened on his sleeve. Teresa leaned back in her chair, calm in her stillness. Her next words fell into the room like stones dropped into deep water. "Because my Mustang," she said, pausing as her eyes locked with his, "was never there." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's jaw dropped. Michael's face drained of all color. "You!" Emily's voice cracked. "What do you mean? The papers. Michael told me." Teresa picked up her cup again, her fingers steady. She took another sip, as if nothing in the world was amiss. The phone buzzed angrily in Michael's hand, the buyer demanding an answer. But Teresa's words had gutted him. His shoulders slumped. He could not even form a reply. For the first time, the balance of power shifted. Teresa was no longer the quiet mother in the corner of the room. She was the one holding the truth that could unravel every lie they had spun, and she did not need to raise her voice to do it. The silence in the room was suffocating. Michael's face was pale, his hands trembling as he dropped the phone onto the table. Emily, red-eyed and hysterical, kept repeating, This can't be happening. This can't be happening. Teresa remained where she was, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch, didn't move toward them with the comforting reflexes of a mother. Instead, she poured herself another cup of tea, letting the gentle stream of amber liquid fill the porcelain cup. The clink of the spoon as she stirred sugar into it cut through the chaos like a blade. Finally, she lifted her gaze, calm and deliberate. "You're wondering," she said softly, "why the buyer discovered rust and rot when my Mustang was supposed to be pristine." Michael swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "What are you saying, Mom? Don't play games right now." Teresa tilted her head slightly, a faint, almost pitying smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not playing games. I'm simply pointing out something you should have realized before you tried to pawn off something that was never yours to sell." Emily shot up from her seat, hair disheveled, eyes wild. "What do you mean? That Mustang was in the garage. We had the keys, the title, everything. Don't you dare try to twist this on us." Teresa set her teacup down carefully, the porcelain chiming gently against the saucer. Her next words fell with the weight of a stone in water. "The Mustang you found in the garage was never mine." Their mouths fell open, disbelief flashing across their faces. Michael let out a strained laugh. "That's impossible. I drove it out myself. Don't you remember? We cleaned it up. No." Teresa cut in, her tone sharp enough to slice through his denial. "What you drove was a husk, a shell, a replica that had been left to rot decades ago. The real car, the one your father and I rebuilt with our hands, the one I polished every Sunday morning. That one was never where you thought it was." Emily staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter. "Then where is it?" she whispered. Teresa's eyes softened at the thought, not for her children, but for the truth she had guarded so fiercely. "Safe, with Mr. Callahan, my neighbor. He's a retired mechanic who knows what that car meant. Years ago, I asked him to keep it at his workshop, away from greedy eyes. He did, without question, because unlike you, he understood loyalty." Michael's jaw clenched, his voice cracking under the weight of rage and humiliation. So we sold... What? Nothing." "Not nothing," Teresa said evenly, standing now, her frame straight and commanding despite her years. "You sold a lie. You sold a rusted shell dressed up as something it could never be. You sold away your last shred of dignity." Emily let out a guttural scream, collapsing into a chair, her hands clawing at her hair. Michael just stared at his mother, the reality sinking in with every breath. Teresa's voice lowered, carrying the quiet authority of a verdict being handed down. "Do you understand what you've done? You didn't just try to sell a car that wasn't yours. You sold away my trust. The little faith I had left that you might still see me as your mother, not as an obstacle or a bank account. That's gone now, irretrievably." The air crackled with the weight of her words. Michael opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Emily sobbed harder, rocking back and forth. Teresa picked up her cup again, took a measured sip, and set it down. "All that's left for you now," she whispered almost to herself, "is the echo of what you tried to steal." The sound of the clock ticking in the background was the only reply. The phone on the table buzzed again, its shrill tone slicing through the suffocating silence. Michael's hands shook as he fumbled to answer. "Hello. Yes, this is Michael. No, sir. Please." His voice cracked, thin and desperate. "I swear it's not what you think. There must be some mistake." On the other end, the man's voice boomed through the tiny speaker, cold and furious. Even from where I sat, I could hear the venom in his tone. You lied to me. The papers don't match the VIN. That car is worthless. You tried to pass me a fraud. Michael swallowed hard. Please, I'll fix this. I'll make it right. Just give me some time. His face had gone pale, sweat dripping down his temple. He darted his eyes toward me like a trapped animal searching for a way out. Emily stood in the corner, her sobs sharp and piercing. She was clutching her phone like it might save her, mascara running down her face in messy black rivers. Michael, tell him it was a mistake. Tell him we didn't know. But Michael couldn't. His lips trembled. His voice grew smaller and smaller until he pressed the phone tight to his ear and whispered, "Please don't sue us. Please." The man on the other end did not soften. His threat came like a hammer. If I don't have my money back in 48 hours, you'll hear from my lawyer. And believe me, son, you don't want that kind of trouble. The call ended with a click so sharp it seemed to split the room in two. Michael collapsed into the chair across from me, his hands buried in his hair. Emily crouched beside him, rocking back and forth like a child, her sobs now hoarse and broken. And me? I sat perfectly still, cradling my teacup in both hands. The steam curled lazily toward the ceiling, fragrant and calm, as if none of this chaos had anything to do with me. Because it didn't. Not anymore. I looked at my son, the man I had carried inside me, the boy whose fevered forehead I had cooled with damp cloths, the child I once taught to tie his shoes and ride his bike. But sitting there now, hunched in fear, his face twisted not with remorse, but with panic, I realized something that tightened my chest in a different way. This was not my boy. My boy had once looked at me with trust and admiration. He had once believed my words to be gospel, my love to be enough. That boy had grown into this man, or rather, had failed to grow at all. The person before me was not my son. He was a frightened child, trapped in a man's body, clinging to schemes and lies instead of work and honor. He had never learned to stand on his own 2 feet, because I had carried him too long. I see you now, Michael. I whispered inwardly, though my lips barely moved. Not as the child I raised, not even as the man I hoped you would become, but as someone who has never truly grown. The thought hurt more than the betrayal itself, because betrayal can be forgiven. But seeing, truly seeing, that your child never became who they were meant to be, there is a grief in that deeper than any wound. Michael lifted his head at last, eyes red and wet, his voice breaking. "Mom, please, you have to help us. They're going to take everything. We'll be ruined." Emily clutched his arm, echoing his plea. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, you can talk to him. You can explain it. Wasn't your fault. You wouldn't let us drown, would you?" I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth coat my throat. Their words fluttered against the walls like frantic birds, but I didn't answer right away. Inside me, something had already shifted. I wasn't looking at my family anymore. I was looking at strangers. And in that moment, I knew. The woman who had spent her life saving them would not rise again this time. Emily's voice sliced through the heavy silence like a shard of glass. "Why should I suffer?" she snapped, her tone dripping with indignation. "It was your mom's junk car anyway, a worthless heap. Everyone knows it. Why should I be the one stuck with the fallout of some old relic nobody cared about?" Her words echoed in the living room, bouncing off the walls with a sting that was sharper than any knife. Michael sat frozen beside her, his head bowed low, but not out of shame, out of fear. His eyes darted toward his wife, as though searching for her approval, like a man chained to her whims. Teresa stood near the window, her hands folded gently in front of her. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't scream or argue back. Instead, she simply let the words settle in the air, thick and poisonous, like smoke that would eventually suffocate its own source. Inside, her heart ached. She thought of all the years she had spent raising Michael, protecting him from the storms of the world, shielding him when he was small and fragile. She remembered nights when he had fevers, when she sat beside his bed whispering lullabies until morning. She remembered his first steps in the driveway, the same driveway where that junk car had been parked for decades. Emily, of course, had no memory of those things. To her, the car was nothing more than scrap metal and a chance to claw her way into another designer dress, another dinner reservation she couldn't afford on her own. Teresa studied Emily's face quietly. She saw no remorse there, no trace of gratitude, just hunger, greed disguised as entitlement. "I'm not going to pay a cent back," Emily continued, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "If that buyer comes after us, it's on you, Michael. Not me. Your mother started this with her ridiculous obsession over that car. Why should I—" Teresa lifted her gaze at that moment. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The stillness of her eyes silenced Emily more effectively than any outburst could have. It was a silence heavy with history. With all the years Teresa had kept her dignity, all the storms she had endured, all the sacrifices she had made. It was the silence of a woman who had seen through Emily long ago, but chose restraint over revenge. Emily fidgeted under that gaze. Her words faltered, her lips pressed together. For just a flicker of a moment, she looked like the child she had never really been. Cornered, defensive, exposed. Michael whispered, "Emily," his voice cracked, unsure, caught between loyalty to his wife and the invisible weight of his mother's quiet judgment. But Teresa still said nothing. She simply turned her eyes toward her son, and in them he saw what he had become. Not the boy she had raised with tenderness, but a man who had bartered away his own integrity piece by piece, until he had nothing left but fear. Teresa's silence wasn't weakness. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, both Michael and Emily were forced to see themselves stripped bare. It was the following morning when Teresa heard the gentle knock on her door. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting thin streaks of gold through her lace curtains. She opened the door, and there stood Mr. Callahan, her neighbor from 2 streets over, a retired mechanic with kind eyes and weathered hands that always smelled faintly of engine oil. "I heard some noise yesterday," he began softly, removing his cap and holding it against his chest. "And then I saw Michael storming out. Thought I'd check in on you, Teresa." Teresa gave him a polite smile, though her heart was still heavy from the storm that had passed through her home. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan. Just family matters." He stepped inside when she invited him, glancing around the kitchen. His eyes settled almost instantly on the framed photograph of Henry on the counter, taken years ago beside the old Mustang. Callahan paused, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You know," he said slowly, "Henry once told me something about that car. It was years back. I was helping him fix the carburetor, and he looked at me and said, 'Joe, this isn't just a car. This is a promise I made to my wife.' I told her, keep it, because one day when I'm gone, it'll help her stand tall again. Teresa's throat tightened. She had never known Henry had confided that to anyone else. She had held on to the Mustang because she thought it was just sentiment, her stubbornness, her longing. But now she realized it was more. Henry had wanted it to be her anchor. Mr. Callahan shifted his weight, eyes warm but firm. I'm telling you this because I think Henry wanted that car to be more than metal and paint. He wanted it to be a shield, a reminder that you were not meant to be discarded when people grew greedy. Teresa looked at him, startled by how a man who had only been a friend in passing could articulate what her own son had failed to grasp. The contrast struck deep. Michael, her flesh and blood, saw the Mustang as junk, something to exploit and sell. Yet this neighbor, this outsider, carried Henry's words with reverence. The weight of betrayal pressed down harder. How could it be that a stranger valued her memories more than her son valued her life's devotion? I am ashamed to say, Callahan continued gently, that I heard Michael brag once, down at the diner, that he'd convince you to sell. Said the car was a waste, just rust in the driveway. I didn't say anything then, but I wish I had, because hearing Henry's voice in my head last night, I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Teresa closed her eyes. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, a flame of clarity flickered. Michael's words, Emily's cruelty, they were no longer foggy excuses or misunderstandings. They were choices that revealed who they truly were. She turned to Mr. Callahan and, with quiet dignity, said, "Thank you. You've given me back Henry's voice. And maybe you've reminded me of my own." The kitchen fell silent for a moment, the ticking clock the only sound. In that silence, Teresa realized something profound. Sometimes family fails us. Sometimes blood betrays us. But unexpected voices can step in to reflect back our worth, reminding us we were never as small or powerless as they wanted us to believe. Michael sat at the head of the dining table, his face pale, his hands trembling as though he could not hold himself together. His eyes, red from sleepless nights, darted between me and Emily. Finally, they brimmed with tears. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. They're threatening to sue. I could lose everything. Please, please help me." Emily leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her chin lifted in defiance. "Don't drag me into this, Michael. It wasn't my decision alone. She could have stopped us," she said coldly, jerking her head toward me. "Besides, that car was worthless. Why is everyone making such a big deal out of it?" Her words cut sharper than any blade, yet I didn't flinch. I let the silence sit heavy between us, a silence that made Emily shift uncomfortably in her chair. Michael sobbed, reaching across the table as if to bridge a distance that had long since grown between mother and son. I folded my hands together, my voice steady. "Michael, Emily, listen carefully. I will not save you this time. The choices you made, the disrespect you showed, not to me, but to the memory of your father, those are yours to carry." Michael's head snapped up, his tears spilling over. "Mom, no. You can't just watch us fall apart. You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me." Emily sneered, her lips curling into a half smile. "See? This is ridiculous. She's punishing us. A real mother wouldn't let her own children suffer." I inhaled deeply, my chest heavy yet strangely light at the same time. "A real mother," I said slowly, "teaches her children that actions have consequences. A real mother does not erase the cost of betrayal. I raised you to stand tall, not to trample over the things that once gave us strength." The room quivered with tension. Michael buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Emily's mask of superiority cracked just enough to reveal a flash of unease. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle into me like stone. "You will face the outcome of your choices. If that means losing everything, so be it. I will not step between you and the storm you created." For a long while, no one spoke. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner echoed like a gavel striking down judgment. And in that silence, a question formed, one that I knew others might ask if they ever heard this story. Does a mother have the right to let her children collapse under the weight of their own mistakes? Or must she always, always stand as their shield, even when they cut her down to the bone? I sat there, calm, resolute. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally choosing not just what was expected of a mother, but what was right for me as a woman, as a human being. The lawsuit hit like a tidal wave. The man who had bought the land discovered the fraudulent contract Michael and Emily had forged, and he wasted no time in filing a civil suit. Court papers landed on their doorstep with the blunt weight of justice, and suddenly the house that had once felt so untouchable now vibrated with panic. Michael sat at the dining room table, papers spread before him, his head buried in his hands. Emily paced the length of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards, her voice rising in shrill bursts of anger. "They can't do this! We didn't know she hadn't signed it properly," Emily snapped, though her words trembled with desperation. Michael slammed his fist against the table. "Of course we knew. You told me she wouldn't fight. You promised me it was fine." Their argument was the echo of rot, blame ricocheting back and forth between them while the reality of their situation pressed in. Their bank account dwindled under legal fees. Creditors began to circle. And for the first time in his adult life, Michael felt the cold bite of a world without a safety net. Teresa watched from the quiet distance of her own home. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk at their downfall. Instead, she stood by her kitchen window, the autumn light spilling over her shoulders, and felt the full weight of motherhood pressing against her chest. Every instinct inside her screamed to step in, to ease their burden, to say, "I'll take care of it." But she didn't. She had made her decision when she walked away from the family meeting. Her children had written their own story, and now they would have to live with its chapters. Word spread quickly through town. People whispered about Michael and Emily selling off jewelry, pawning heirlooms that once glittered at family dinners. Emily's diamond earrings vanished first. Then Michael's watch, a gift from Henry on his graduation day, went to a faceless buyer in exchange for quick cash. They borrowed against credit cards, called old acquaintances for loans, and still it wasn't enough. Nights became restless, Michael waking in cold sweats, Emily curling into herself as the walls of privilege closed in tighter. One evening, Michael arrived at Teresa's door. He looked older, thinner, his eyes carrying the same hollow desperation that once belonged only to addicts and gamblers. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking, "I need help. Just anything you can spare. Please." Teresa opened the door wider, but did not invite him in. She studied her son, her child, the boy she had once cradled against her chest, and for a fleeting second, her hand twitched as if to reach for him. But then she remembered the signatures, the lies, the violence of betrayal carved into her very bones. I'm sorry, Michael, she said softly. This is your lesson to learn. I cannot save you. His jaw clenched, tears welled, but pride forced him to turn away before they could fall. He walked back into the night, shoulders bent under the weight of consequence. For the audience, if they could have seen it, it was a moral conflict as sharp as glass. Was Teresa right? Could a mother ever truly step aside while her children drowned in the consequences of their own greed? Or was her silence a deeper cruelty, the kind of wound that leaves scars for generations? Teresa asked herself the same question as she locked the door that night. Yet in her heart, she knew. Love that shields wrongdoing only breeds more ruin. Her silence wasn't abandonment. It was the final act of love, a painful one, but the only way her children might ever learn that choices come with costs. The first time I turned the key in the Mustang again, the sound startled me. The growl of the engine was not just mechanical, it was memory coming alive. My fingers trembled on the steering wheel, but the vibration under my palms steadied me in a way nothing else had for months. For years, the car had sat quietly in the garage, draped under a canvas cover like a sleeping beast. Michael once mocked it, calling it Dad's relic. Emily said I should just donate it to a museum instead of keeping it around. But I couldn't let it go. Henry had left it for me, and even when the kids tried to belittle that gift, I knew deep down, this car was not just metal. It was his voice, his breath, his presence. The leather seat exhaled its familiar scent the moment I settled into it. Aged, warm, faintly sweet, like time itself preserved. I closed my eyes, and for a heartbeat, I swore I could feel Henry sliding into the passenger seat beside me. The same way he had on those long Sunday drives through the countryside, where he always insisted on rolling down the windows no matter the weather, so he could let the world in. Sunlight poured across the windshield, bending into golden shards that flickered across the dashboard. I reached for the gear shift, hesitated, then smiled. "All right, Henry," I whispered. "Let's go." The car rolled forward, slow at first. Every creak and hum like an old song I had forgotten how to hum. The road outside shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. As I merged into the open stretch beyond town, the engine roared deeper, filling me with a surge that went beyond adrenaline. It was as if the Mustang was reminding me, reminding us, that we still had motion left, even after grief, even after betrayal. I slowed deliberately at the first curve. "Slow down at the pivot," Henry used to say, his hand brushing mine as he shifted gears. It wasn't just about driving, it was his philosophy for life. Don't rush the corners. Respect the turns. Lean into them, but steady your breath. Now, with the wheel firm beneath my hands, I inhaled the crisp air through the open window. The wind tangled my hair, and instead of feeling messy, it felt like freedom. I let myself notice every detail. The faint rumble of the tires over asphalt, the sun-warmed leather pressing against my back, the glint of chrome in the side mirror catching brief flashes of light. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about saving Michael or rescuing Emily from their poor choices. I wasn't burdened by the weight of bills, demands, or expectations. I wasn't anyone's backup plan. I was simply Teresa, driving, breathing, alive. The Mustang picked up speed, and I eased it down again at another pivot. I could almost hear Henry chuckle. He always said the car was like us. Not the fastest, not the newest, but reliable, steady, and full of soul. That thought made my chest tighten with both ache and warmth. "Henry," I whispered into the wind, "you were right. Keeping it has kept me. A quiet peace settled over me as the road stretched open ahead. The betrayal of my children no longer felt like an anchor chained to my ankles. It was still there, yes, but in the Mustang's roar, I felt something else, something stronger. Silent strength, self-worth, healing that came not from confrontation, but from movement. I didn't need to prove to Michael or Emily that I was worthy of respect. I didn't need to lecture them, to rescue them, or to shield them from the storm of consequences they had brought upon themselves. What I needed was this: to feel the engine's rhythm match my heartbeat, to know that I still had direction even when others had tried to erase it. When I finally pulled the car into the driveway, the sun was dipping low, throwing copper light across the hood. I turned off the ignition, sat still, and placed my hand gently on the passenger seat. "We did it," I murmured, and in that stillness I could almost hear Henry answer back. Not in words, but in presence, the kind that never truly leaves, as long as you dare to keep driving forward. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, turning the room golden as Teresa sat quietly in her chair. Her fingers traced the cold, familiar shape of the Mustang key resting in her palm. The edges were worn smooth, the logo faint from years of use, but it carried more weight than metal ever could. To anyone else, it was just a car key. To her, it was Henry's voice, Henry's laughter, Henry's hand closing hers around a promise. She closed her eyes, and the memory unfolded as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. It was a late summer evening, cicadas humming in the distance, the garage door half open to let in the breeze. Henry leaned against the hood of the Mustang, wiping grease from his fingers with an old rag. His hair was already silvering, but his grin was the same boyish curve she'd fallen in love with decades earlier. "You know," he had said, looking at the car, "this Mustang might break down one day. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now. Things rust, engines fail, paint chips." He turned then, his eyes steady on hers, voice soft but firm. "But your love for this family, don't you ever let anyone break that. Cars you can fix or replace. Love, once you let it rot, is harder to restore." She had laughed then, brushing off the grease smudge he left on her arm. "And what about when love is taken for granted?" she teased. Henry had pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Then you stand strong, because even if they don't see it today, one day they'll know they stood on a foundation you built. And you, Teresa, you're the anchor. Don't ever let them make you doubt it." The words rang louder now than they ever had. She could almost feel the weight of his hand on her shoulder. Steady, grounding. The Mustang key gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and Teresa tightened her grip on it. This wasn't just a token of a car. It was a compass pointing her back to herself. For too long, she had allowed her children's voices, demanding, dismissive, cruel, to drown out Henry's. But here, in the silence of her home, his words rose above the noise. The key became her anchor. When doubts tried to claw at her, am I a bad mother for letting them stumble? Should I have saved them? Just one more time? She looked down at that piece of metal and heard Henry again. "Cars can break. Love shouldn't. But love isn't rescue, Teresa. It's truth." Her chest tightened, tears threatening to spill, but she did not let them. Instead, she whispered into the stillness, "I miss you, Henry. But I'm learning. I think you'd be proud." Out the window, the Mustang sat in the driveway, polished to a soft shine. A relic, maybe, but also a symbol of resilience. Every scratch on its body carried a memory. The road trips, The late-night drives when she and Henry would talk about dreams. The afternoons when the children, still young and laughing, piled into the back seat. Teresa rose slowly, slipping the key into her pocket. The metal was warm against her thigh, as though it had absorbed her heartbeat. She didn't need to drive anywhere right now, just knowing she could, that the Mustang was there, that Henry's words lived on in every turn of the ignition. That was enough. The past could never be reclaimed, but the lessons Henry left behind could guide her forward. She wasn't walking into the future empty-handed. She had his voice, his wisdom, his love, and in her palm, whenever she needed it, she had the key. The phone rang late in the evening, cutting through the gentle hum of the crickets outside Teresa's kitchen window. She glanced at the screen. Michael. For a long moment, she let it ring, staring at the name as if weighing the weight of decades compressed into a single vibration. Finally, she answered, her voice steady. Mom. Michael's tone carried exhaustion and a strange fragility she hadn't heard since he was a boy who once scraped his knees and ran crying to her. I don't even know where to start. Teresa didn't say anything right away. She listened to the hollow echo of the line, then caught the faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing in the background. Emily. She was there, silent, like a shadow lingering in the room. Michael cleared his throat, words tumbling out in broken pieces. We lost so much. The lawsuit. It drained us. I had to sell Emily's jewelry. We borrowed from everyone we could. I thought I could fix it. I thought I was smart enough, strong enough to protect what Dad left us. But I only ruined it. And through it all, you never once stepped in. You just let it happen. His voice cracked. Why, Mom? Why didn't you stop me? Teresa closed her eyes, her fingers brushing against the cool edge of the Mustang's keys on the table beside her. The metal was smooth, grounding. She could almost hear Henry's voice in her memory, steady, warm, telling her that sometimes silence could hold more weight than any outburst. Finally, she answered. Because some lessons, Michael, can't be bought with money I hand over. They have to be paid for with your own choices. Her tone was not cruel, not sharp, just calm, deliberate. There was a long pause on the line. She imagined her son's face, pinched with guilt, and Emily's lips pressed tightly together in shame. I'm sorry, Michael whispered. The words were almost childlike, fragile. Teresa's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes were wet. She lifted the phone closer, her voice barely above a murmur, but carrying the weight of unshakable truth. Don't ever think I don't know the value of things, Michael. I know it better than anyone. I just stayed silent. The silence after her words wasn't empty. It was charged, alive. A silence that spoke louder than scolding ever could. It pressed into Michael and Emily, into the space between them, until it became unbearable. On the other end, Emily finally shifted, and though she said nothing, Teresa heard her muffled sob. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was something softer, heavier. A confirmation that silence, when wielded with purpose, could be a form of power. She let the silence linger a little longer before ending the call. No dramatic goodbye. No lecture. Just the quiet assertion of her presence, her boundaries, her unspoken love. When the kitchen returned to stillness, Teresa sat with the Mustang keys in her palm, turning them over slowly. The silence in the room no longer felt heavy. It felt like strength, an invisible fortress she had built around herself, one no betrayal could tear down. The garage felt different that morning. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight, and the air smelled of oil, steel, and something softer, like possibility. Teresa had come back, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Mr. Callahan was already there, sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with the honest grime of labor. He looked up when she walked in, surprise flashing across his face, quickly followed by something warmer. "You came back," he said simply. Teresa nodded, smoothing her hands over her jacket. "The Mustang is done. She doesn't need me anymore. But maybe I still need this place." He chuckled, then motioned her over to a car under a canvas tarp. With a quiet reverence, he pulled the cover back to reveal a frame. A car that was nothing more than bare bones, yet held within it the promise of revival. "Thought I'd start restoring this one," he said. "But I'd rather not do it alone. What do you say, Teresa? Want to help me bring her back to life?" The offer landed in her chest like a gentle thunderclap. For weeks, Teresa had been pouring her grief, her anger, and her silence into the Mustang. That car had been Henry's gift, Henry's anchor. Restoring it was like stitching her heart back together. But now she saw something beyond survival. A beginning. She ran her fingers along the edge of the frame, the cool metal grounding her. "You know," she said softly, "Henry always told me, cars can break, engines can fail, but love, the love you carry for your family, you can't let anyone break that." Callahan's eyes softened. "Wise man, you're Henry." "Yes," Teresa whispered. "He was." There was a long silence then, not empty, but full. The kind of silence where things mend quietly, like cracks filling with gold. Teresa picked up a wrench, feeling its weight in her hand. It was heavy but steady, just like the choice she was making. She wasn't repairing this car for Henry, or for Michael, or for anyone else. She was doing it for herself. For the woman who had been told she was too quiet, too small, too easy to overlook. She tightened the first bolt, and something inside her clicked into place with it. As the hours slipped by, Teresa and Callahan worked side by side, laughter occasionally breaking the hum of tools and the rustle of sandpaper. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to be. Each small motion, wiping grease from her hands, adjusting a piece of metal, listening to the hollow echo of a part being tested, was its own quiet act of defiance against everything that had tried to break her. When she finally stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow, Teresa looked at the half-finished car and smiled. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, she realized, were not about noise. They were about choice. Her gaze fell on the Mustang parked in the corner, gleaming as if Henry himself had polished it one last time. That car would always be her anchor. But this project, was her compass, a way forward. She rested the wrench on the hood and exhaled, steady and sure. "Sometimes," Teresa said aloud, almost to herself, "to stand tall, you don't need to shout. You just need an engine to start again." The words echoed in the garage, soft but powerful, carried by the scent of oil and hope. And for the first time in a long time, Teresa felt not just alive, but ready. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet as Teresa eased her hands on the steering wheel. The lake stretched out beside her like a sheet of glass, reflecting the fading light. The wind slipped through the open window, catching her silver hair and tossing it gently, like the pages of a book being turned. For the first time in years, her face wasn't weighed down by sorrow. It carried something lighter, tranquil, steady, resolved. The Mustang hummed beneath her, smooth, alive. Not just a machine, but a companion. She thought of Henry's words again. Cars can break down, but your love for family, don't let anyone break that. It wasn't just about the car. It was about her, about resilience, about knowing her own worth, even when others didn't. The betrayal still existed in the corners of her memory. Michael's cold message, Emily's silence, the day her memories had been sold as if they were junk. But the sting no longer controlled her. That chapter belonged to them. This one belonged to her. She slowed near the water's edge, letting the tires crunch against the gravel. For a moment, she sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the engine, the distant call of birds settling in for the evening. The lake's surface rippled with the wind, and Teresa saw her reflection there. Not the weary, forgotten mother they had tried to make her, but a woman who had stood her ground, quietly, firmly. She'd not shouted. She had not cursed. She had simply chosen silence. And in that silence, she'd discovered power. The Mustang's keys rested on the passenger seat beside her, catching the light. They were more than metal and grooves. They were an anchor. A reminder that starting over didn't always require permission from anyone else. It only needed courage and the willingness to turn the ignition one more time. Teresa exhaled, long and slow, as if releasing years of unspoken grief. A smile found its way onto her lips, not wide, not forced, but soft, almost like a secret kept between herself and the wind. She pressed her foot gently on the accelerator, and the car moved forward, rolling along the curve of the lake. Each mile felt less like an escape and more like a return to herself, to the woman she had always been before the sacrifices, before the betrayals. The road stretched ahead, infinite and unknown, and for the first time in decades, she welcomed it with no fear. The echo of her thought lingered, simple yet profound. Sometimes, to stand tall, you don't need to shout. You just need an engine to start again. The scene faded into the horizon, leaving her silhouette against the last light of day. A woman reborn, quiet but unbreakable. And then the camera turned outward, toward the audience. Her story lingered in the silence, waiting for others to step in, to answer the question she carried to them, almost like a gift. If your child sold your memories, would you forgive? Or let them face the weight of their own choices? I want to hear your story.